When my son walked away without looking back, I didn't call him. I didn't follow him. I stood still and made a decision that changed everything. People expect parents to chase, to explain, to beg for connection. But I realized something that day: chasing someone who already chose distance only teaches them they were right to leave. So I stayed where I was and let the silence speak for me. The moment my son walked away without looking back didn't feel dramatic. There was no argument echoing in the air, no sharp words thrown like weapons, no crowd to witness the fracture. That was what made it so final. It happened in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for permission before it settles into your life. We were standing just outside my house. The door was open behind me, the same door I had held open for him countless times over the years when he came home late, when he needed advice, when he needed reassurance without knowing how to ask for it. That door had always meant welcome. That day, it meant nothing to him. He said very little, just enough. "I need to move forward," he said, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "I think it's better if we keep our distance." Distance. Such a clean word for something so heavy. I waited for him to look at me, for some flicker of doubt, some hesitation that would tell me this was harder for him than he wanted it to be. But his eyes were already elsewhere, fixed on a future that did not include me in any meaningful way. In that moment, I realized this conversation hadn't started here. It had been concluded long before he arrived. I nodded. That single movement surprised him more than anything I could have said. He had expected resistance. Parents are predictable that way. We argue, we question, we plead, we reach for the past as if it can anchor the present. I did none of that. "All right," I said quietly. The word hung between us, heavier than any accusation. He shifted his weight, uncertain now, as if my calm had disrupted the script he had prepared. For a brief second, I thought he might say more. Explain. Soften the blow. But explanations require vulnerability, and he wasn't prepared for that. So he turned and walked away. No pause, no glance back, no final confirmation that this was really happening. I stood there long after his footsteps faded, aware of the stillness settling around me. The house behind me felt unchanged, yet completely different. Like a stage after the actors have left everything in place, but stripped of purpose. People often imagine betrayal as loud, as something unmistakable and cruel. But the most lasting betrayals are quiet. They arrive wrapped in calm language and reasonable tone. They don't announce themselves as endings. They simply step away and assume you will follow. I didn't. That was the decision I made in that moment. Not out of pride, not out of anger, but out of something deeper. A realization that chasing someone who has already chosen distance doesn't restore connection. It only confirms your disposability. I closed the door behind me and stood in the silence, aware that a line had been crossed not by him leaving, but by me choosing not to run after him. That was the beginning, not of revenge, not of confrontation, but of a silence that would change everything. The silence that followed him did not rush inside the house. It lingered at the doorway, as if deciding whether it was allowed to enter. I could still see the faint outline of where he had stood moments earlier. The space his presence had occupied now hollow and strangely neutral. Silence has a temperature. This one was cool, steady, and deliberate. I didn't move right away. There is an instinct, especially as a parent, to fill empty spaces quickly, to call out, to soften endings, to make sure no goodbye is ever truly final. That instinct rose in me like muscle memory, but it stopped short of action. I recognized it for what it was, habit, not truth. I closed the door slowly. The sound of its shutting felt louder than it should have, not because it echoed, but because it marked a boundary. I had spent years believing boundaries were walls you built against others. I was learning they were lines you drew for yourself. This was the first one I had drawn without apology. Inside, the house felt unchanged. The furniture stood where it always had. The light fell across the same familiar surfaces, and yet something fundamental had shifted. Not broken, shifted. Like a room after rearrangement, familiar but newly defined. I leaned against the door and exhaled. That breath mattered. It wasn't relief. It wasn't grief. It was acknowledgement, an acceptance that something irreversible had occurred, and that pretending otherwise would only prolong the impact. Silence, I realized, was not something I had fallen into. It was something I had chosen. My phone sat on the table nearby. For years, it had been an extension of my concern, messages drafted and erased, calls made and missed, reminders set to check in, to follow up, to make sure nothing drifted too far without my awareness. I looked at it now and felt no urgency. That absence startled me. I did not reach for it. Instead, I walked through the house, not aimlessly, but attentively. I noticed small things I had overlooked before. The way the floor creaked near the hallway, the faint mark on the wall where a picture frame once hung, the quiet order of a life that no longer revolved around anticipating someone else's arrival or departure. The silence followed me, but it did not press. It observed. That night, I slept without interruption. No restless turning, no replaying of conversations, no mental rehearsals of what I should have said differently. My body had registered the decision before my mind fully caught up. When you stop resisting what is happening, rest comes easier. Morning arrived without urgency. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the street wake up. Cars passed. People walked dogs. The world continued without commentary. That continuity grounded me. It reminded me that while my relationship had changed, life itself had not paused to accommodate it. And that was when the full weight of my choice settled in. By not chasing him, I had accepted something difficult but necessary. That connection cannot be preserved by pursuit alone. That love does not obligate you to abandon yourself. That silence, when chosen deliberately, is not absence, it is alignment. I wasn't waiting for him to return. I was allowing myself to remain. And in that stillness, I understood that the silence on the doorstep was not an ending. It was a threshold. People assume that not chasing is an act of pride, that it comes from ego, from a refusal to bend. The truth is far less dramatic and far more difficult to accept. I didn't follow my son because I finally understood what chasing actually teaches the person who leaves. Chasing tells them they were right to walk away. It tells them that distance creates power, that withdrawal guarantees pursuit, that your presence is conditional on their approval. I had spent years, without realizing it, reinforcing that lesson in smaller ways, by smoothing over discomfort, by explaining myself when no explanation was required, by stepping forward every time he stepped back. I wasn't going to do that again. As he walked away, I felt the familiar pull rise in me, the urge to call his name, to ask what I had done wrong, to promise that things could be different if he just gave me another chance. That urge was not love. It was fear. Fear of being left behind. Fear of being irrelevant. Fear of sitting with unanswered questions. Fear makes people chase. And I had chased enough in my life to recognize where it leads. It leads to imbalance, to relationships where one person moves freely and the other follows anxiously, where closeness is measured by effort, not respect. I thought about the times I had followed before, not physically, but emotionally. The late-night calls answered without hesitation, the plans rearranged at the last minute, the boundaries softened just this once. Each time, I told myself I was being supportive. In reality, I was teaching him that my needs could wait indefinitely. That lesson had matured. By the time he walked away without looking back, he wasn't testing whether I would follow. He was assuming it. That assumption was the final signal that something had gone deeply out of balance. So, I stayed where I was, not to punish him, not to prove a point, but to interrupt a pattern that no longer served either of us. Not following him was the first time I chose clarity over comfort. Comfort would have been calling out, keeping the connection alive at any cost. Clarity meant accepting that a relationship sustained by pursuit alone is already collapsing, it just hasn't admitted it yet. I also understood something else in that moment, something harder to admit. If I followed him, I would be asking him to let me back into a life he had already redesigned without me. That invitation, if accepted, would come with conditions: silence, compliance, smaller presence. I was no longer willing to accept those terms. I didn't follow him because I didn't want to return as an accessory. I wanted to remain a person, There is a difference between reaching for connection and chasing after permission to exist in someone else's world. I had crossed that line before without noticing. This time, I stopped at it. As the door closed behind me and the silence settled into its new shape, I knew this decision would be misunderstood. Silence often is. It would be labeled indifference, coldness, pride. I accepted that, because misunderstanding is easier to live with than self-betrayal. And by not following him, I had taken the first step away from the version of myself who believed love required pursuit. I knew what chasing would have cost me, because I had paid that price before quietly, over years, in ways that didn't leave visible marks but changed me all the same. Chasing doesn't just drain your energy. It rewrites how you see yourself. It teaches you to measure your worth by how quickly you respond, how much you're willing to bend, how little you demand in return. If I had followed him that day, I would have crossed a line I could never uncross. I would have taught him that walking away carries no consequence. That distance is a negotiation tactic. That my presence is guaranteed no matter how it's treated. That lesson would not have healed anything between us. It would have hardened the imbalance already in place. I imagined the scene clearly. Me calling out to him, me asking him to wait, me explaining myself again. The words would have sounded reasonable, gentle, loving. And in that reasonableness, I would have erased something essential. I would have made it clear that my dignity was conditional on his approval. Chasing would have shrunk me, not all at once. That's not how it happens. It happens incrementally. First, you accept silence where conversation should be. Then, you accept decisions made without you. Then, you accept being informed instead of included. Each acceptance feels small in isolation. Together, they form a life lived at the edge of someone else's priorities. I had lived that life longer than I cared to admit. There were moments in the past when I felt it an unease I couldn't name, a sense that I was adjusting more than I was being met. I dismissed it as part of being a parent, as sacrifice, as unconditional love. But unconditional love does not require unconditional access. That distinction had taken me years to learn. If I had chased him, I would have reinforced the idea that my role was to stabilize his choices, no matter how those choices were made. I would have remained the safety net beneath decisions I had no part in shaping. That position is comfortable for everyone except the one holding it. Chasing also would have cost me honesty, because once you chase, you can't speak freely. You temper your words. You avoid discomfort. You prioritize keeping the door open over saying what's true. I had already begun to censor myself in small ways, choosing harmony over clarity. Following him would have completed that transformation. I would have become careful not to upset, careful not to disagree, careful not to remind him that relationships are mutual. That kind of carefulness is not kindness. It is self-abandonment disguised as patience. Standing still that day protected something fragile but vital. Not the relationship as it had been that was already changing, but my sense of self within it. I chose to remain whole rather than remain connected at any cost. What chasing would have cost me was not just pride. It would have cost me my voice. And once you lose that, getting it back is far harder than enduring the silence that comes from choosing yourself. He expected a reaction, not because he wanted one, but because history had taught him to. For years, my responses had been predictable, measured, patient, always oriented toward repair. I had been the one who closed gaps, smoothed edges, made the difficult conversations easier to avoid. That pattern had shaped his expectations more than any words ever could. He expected me to call him that night. I knew it because of the way he had paused before leaving. The slight hesitation that suggested he was waiting for something to interrupt his resolve. A voice behind him. A question that reopened the door. When none came, he didn't turn back, but he didn't accelerate either. He was listening for pursuit. He expected messages the next morning. A careful text. An invitation to talk. A reassurance that distance didn't mean detachment. That his decision was being respected but not accepted. That I would hold the tension long enough for him to reconsider without losing face. He expected me to involve others. Parents do that when they're desperate. They triangulate. They ask relatives to check in, friends to mediate, anyone to soften the silence. I didn't. Silence, left uninterrupted, tells the truth faster than any intermediary. He expected guilt. He expected me to wonder what I had done wrong, to revisit old conversations with a critical eye turned inward. That expectation wasn't cruel. It was familiar. I had carried that burden quietly for years. When something felt off, I assumed responsibility by default. He had grown accustomed to that dynamic without noticing it. What he didn't expect was stillness, not coldness, not withdrawal. Stillness, the absence of corrective motion. The refusal to rush in and stabilize what had been unsettled. Stillness is unsettling when you're used to momentum doing the work for you. Days passed, then weeks. At first, the lack of response probably felt like freedom, space without friction, autonomy without negotiation. That feeling doesn't last. It never does. Freedom that relies on someone else's silence eventually turns into uncertainty. I could feel the misjudgment settling in. Small signs surfaced, tentative messages that said nothing important, casual updates offered without context, neutral check-ins that tested the waters. Each one assumed the same thing, that I was still nearby, just quieter, that I would reappear if needed. I didn't. He had mistaken restraint for retreat. Restraint is intentional. Retreat is reactive. One creates clarity, the other avoids it. By choosing restraint, I removed the feedback loop he depended on to gauge his position. Without reaction, there was nothing to measure against. That absence changed the balance. He began to realize that his expectations were built on a version of me that no longer existed. That realization didn't arrive as shock. It arrived as discomfort. Discomfort is how assumptions begin to dissolve. I wasn't teaching him a lesson. I was simply no longer confirming one. There is a particular kind of misunderstanding that happens when silence is mistaken for indifference. I allowed that misunderstanding to exist, not because I wanted him to think I didn't care, but because correcting it would have restored the very dynamic I had chosen to step away from. Caring does not require constant demonstration. Sometimes it requires restraint. He began to believe I was unmoved. That belief didn't form overnight. It took shape gradually, reinforced by my lack of response, by the absence of urgency, by the way time passed without interruption. From his perspective, my stillness looked like withdrawal. From mine, it was alignment. I was no longer performing concern to keep a connection alive. Letting him believe I didn't care created space for overconfidence. Overconfidence is subtle at first. It shows up as certainty that the decision was correct, that the outcome was manageable, that nothing essential had been lost. When people believe their choice carried no cost, they stop examining it. They move forward without looking back, convinced the ground beneath them is solid. That conviction depended on my silence. If I had reached out to clarify, to reassure, to remind him of my presence, it would have disrupted that confidence. It would have forced him to reconsider the weight of his decision. I didn't do that. I let his certainty stand on its own. I noticed how his messages, when they came, changed in tone. At first, they were neutral, informational, updates offered without invitation. Then they grew casual, almost light, jokes without context, observations shared as if nothing fundamental had shifted. Each message assumed continuity. Each one tested whether my silence was temporary. I responded politely, briefly, and without emotion. That balance confused him. Politeness without pursuit doesn't fit familiar scripts. It neither confronts nor reassures. It leaves the other person to interpret the silence on their own terms. He chose the interpretation that felt most comfortable. That I was fine, that I had adjusted, that his absence no longer mattered. That belief made him careless. Carelessness doesn't mean cruelty. It means assumption. Assumption that access will remain, that doors will reopen if needed. That silence is a sign of weakness rather than resolve. He spoke more freely to others. He planned without factoring me in. He moved as if the past had been neatly resolved. I watched all of this without commentary. Not because I was detached, but because I understood something he did not yet see. Silence, once misinterpreted, reveals how people behave when they think nothing is at stake. That behavior is the most honest version of them. Letting him believe I didn't care wasn't a tactic. It was a boundary. I was no longer responsible for managing his perception of me. If he needed reassurance to feel stable, he would have to find it elsewhere. If he needed validation, it would have to come from within. And if he needed me again, it would not be because I chased him. It would be because the silence had shown him what my presence had quietly provided all along. There is a moment when silence stops being interpreted and starts being respected. It doesn't happen all at once. It begins when people realize that the absence they assumed was temporary has weight structure, even. That was the moment silence became a boundary. I noticed the change in how my son spoke to me. Before, his messages had carried an assumption of access. Even when he didn't ask for anything directly, the undertone was there, I can reach you whenever I want. Now, there was hesitation. Messages arrived less frequently and with more care. He no longer spoke as if I were waiting on the other end. Boundaries don't announce themselves. They're recognized. The silence had drawn a line neither of us had named, but both of us could feel. On my side, it felt like stability. On his, it felt like uncertainty. That difference mattered. Stability comes from alignment. Uncertainty comes from losing leverage. I hadn't set out to create distance. I had simply stopped crossing it. That distinction was important. I wasn't rejecting him. I wasn't punishing him. I was no longer absorbing the emotional labor required to keep a connection alive on my own. Silence had become the space where responsibility shifted. I could see him testing the boundary. Small questions, neutral updates, casual references to shared memories. Each one was an attempt to reestablish familiarity without addressing what had changed. I responded kindly, but I didn't step closer. Kindness without proximity confuses people who expect one to lead to the other. He grew quieter after that, not withdrawn, measured. The silence was no longer something he could ignore. It was something he had to navigate, and navigating silence is uncomfortable when you're used to noise doing the work for you. I felt no urge to explain. Explanation would have softened the boundary, turned it back into a negotiation. Boundaries held by explanation eventually collapse. Boundaries held by consistency endure. The silence also changed how I felt. I was no longer alert, no longer bracing for the next interaction. The relationship had found its new shape, and that shape no longer required my constant adjustment. I could engage without tension, disengage without guilt. That freedom was subtle but profound. Silence had done something words never managed to do. It had equalized the space between us, not by pulling him closer, but by anchoring me where I stood. That was when I understood this was no longer about whether he would return or reach out differently. It was about whether I would step back into a role that no longer fit. The boundary made that decision unnecessary. I had already chosen, and from that point on, silence wasn't something that needed to be explained. It was something that needed to be respected. The most significant changes rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with confrontation or demand recognition. They happen quietly, beneath the surface. While everyone is still reacting to old patterns, that was the kind of shift taking place between us, one my son didn't notice until it was already complete. He believed the distance was static. From his perspective, nothing was moving. I wasn't pushing back. I wasn't pulling him closer. The silence appeared stable, even passive. What he didn't see was that the center of gravity had changed. The relationship no longer revolved around his decisions. It revolved around my boundaries. That change altered everything. I stopped anticipating his needs. That may sound small, but it had defined my role for years. Anticipation is invisible labor. It happens quietly, before anyone asks, before anyone realizes something could have gone wrong. When I stopped doing it, nothing collapsed immediately. That's what made it deceptive. Life continued, plans unfolded, schedules filled, responsibilities shifted slightly but steadily. He didn't notice the missing support at first because he had never seen it clearly to begin with. You don't miss what you assume will always be there. I noticed it though. I felt the difference in how my days moved. I no longer rearranged myself around his timeline. I didn't check my phone with the same reflexive urgency. Decisions were made without factoring in how they might ripple outward. That internal realignment gave me a sense of control I hadn't realized I'd lost. The shift also changed how others interacted with me. Without my constant availability, conversations grew more intentional. Requests became clearer. Expectations softened. People adjust quickly when the ground beneath them stops flexing. That adjustment doesn't require explanation, it requires consistency. My son, meanwhile, continued operating on outdated assumptions. He assumed I would still be there to smooth things over, that if something became complicated, I would step in, quietly. That silence meant readiness. Those assumptions worked for a while, until they didn't. The first cracks appeared in small ways. A missed detail, a delayed response, a decision that carried unexpected weight. Nothing dramatic, just enough friction to introduce doubt. Doubt is uncomfortable when you don't know where it comes from. He attributed it to stress, to bad timing, to external factors. He didn't attribute it to me. That was the blind spot. He didn't realize that by not chasing him, I had also stopped compensating for him. I wasn't absorbing uncertainty anymore. I wasn't buffering outcomes. I was allowing consequences to land where they belonged. That realization, when it finally came, would not feel like betrayal to him. It would feel like absence. And absence, when it replaces assumption, forces awareness. I wasn't waiting for that moment. I wasn't planning it. The shift had already occurred. I was living inside it, grounded and steady, while he was still orienting himself using a map that no longer matched the terrain. That is the nature of quiet change. By the time it's noticed, it's already irreversible. Assumptions don't form suddenly. They settle slowly, like dust in a room no one has disturbed for a while. Once settled, they begin to feel permanent. That was what happened next. My son didn't question the silence anymore, he explained it to himself. And explanations, once repeated often enough, harden into belief. He assumed I had accepted everything, not just the distance, but the reasoning behind it. He assumed I had adjusted, recalibrated my expectations, moved on emotionally. That assumption allowed him to move forward without reflection. Reflection would have required discomfort. Certainty allowed momentum. I could hear it in the way he spoke. There was a confidence in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in absence. He spoke as if the separation had been resolved simply because it had not been challenged. Silence, in his mind, had become agreement. That belief gave him freedom. He made decisions more quickly. He spoke about the future with assurance. He referenced plans without hesitation. In his version of events, the past had been neatly concluded, and whatever followed was his to shape without interference. That freedom felt earned to him, not borrowed. Borrowed freedom always carries interest. The assumptions extended beyond me. They influenced how he engaged with others, how he delegated responsibility, how he handled uncertainty. When you believe a stabilizing presence will always be available, you take risks differently. You move faster. You prepare less. You trust that gaps will be filled before they widen. He trusted that. I noticed the consequences before he did. Small misalignments, decisions that required more effort than expected, outcomes that didn't resolve themselves as smoothly. Nothing alarming, just enough friction to slow momentum. He dismissed it as coincidence. Temporary disruption. Everyone does it first. Assumptions are persuasive because they protect identity. To question them would have meant questioning his choice to walk away. It would have meant revisiting a decision he wanted to believe was final and correct. That kind of reconsideration is difficult when you've built confidence on top of certainty. So he didn't reconsider. Instead, he doubled down. He leaned into independence, into autonomy, into the narrative that separation had been necessary and beneficial. He spoke less about me, as if minimizing my presence would solidify his version of events. Silence, he believed, had done its work. He didn't realize it was still working, just not in the way he imagined. The mistakes began quietly. Details overlooked. Timing misjudged. Support assumed but not secured. Each mistake was small enough to ignore, but together they formed a pattern. Patterns reveal themselves whether or not you're ready to see them. I stayed where I was, not watching with anticipation, not waiting for failure, simply living my life without intervening. Intervention would have preserved his assumptions. Non-intervention allowed reality to speak. That was the difference now. He had built his certainty on my silence. I had built mine on alignment. And alignment, unlike assumption, does not collapse when tested. Distance becomes dangerous only after it becomes familiar. At first, it feels temporary, like a pause that will eventually resolve itself. But when days turn into weeks and weeks into routines, distance stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like the natural order of things. That was when I knew something irreversible was taking place. Our interactions settled into predictability. There were no sudden gaps, no dramatic silences. Messages arrived occasionally, measured and neutral. Updates were shared without invitation, as if to confirm continuity without requiring closeness. The tone was polite, almost professional. Familiarity without intimacy. Contact without connection. That normalcy mattered. Normalcy dulls urgency. It removes the instinct to repair. When something feels stable, even if it's distant, people stop questioning it. My son stopped questioning the absence between us. It no longer felt like something that needed to be addressed. It simply existed. I noticed how easily I adapted. That surprised me more than anything else. I had expected distance to feel sharp, to press against my routines, to remind me constantly of what was missing. Instead, it softened into the background. My life filled the space naturally, without effort or resistance. The emotional drift was subtle. I thought of him less often, not because I cared less, but because my mind was no longer anchored to unresolved tension. When thoughts of him did surface, they didn't pull me toward action. They passed through quietly, like memories that no longer ask for response. That emotional shift was not intentional. It was the result of alignment. When your actions match your values, your emotions follow. I was no longer living in contradiction, wanting respect while tolerating imbalance. That coherence settled something deep inside me. The consequences began to surface beyond emotion. Plans that once included me no longer did. Events came and went without notice. I learned about them later, if at all. That exclusion didn't sting the way it once might have. Information without expectation carries no emotional charge. I also noticed how rarely he now spoke about certainty. Earlier, his words had carried confidence assurance that separation was the right choice, that independence had simplified things. Now, that certainty had faded into pragmatism. He spoke about managing, about handling, about figuring things out as they came. Confidence had given way to effort. Effort is honest. It reflects reality rather than assumption. I didn't comment on the shift. Commentary would have pulled me back into a role I no longer occupied. Distance had become the new normal, and normal does not invite analysis. What struck me most was how peaceful that normal felt. Not empty, not resigned, peaceful. The absence of constant adjustment had lightened my days. I moved through them without anticipation or regret. I wasn't waiting for reconciliation or bracing for further separation. I was simply living. That, more than anything, marked the change. Distance had stopped being something to endure. It had become something to inhabit. And once inhabited, it no longer felt like loss. It felt like reality. He didn't come back directly. That would have required certainty, and certainty was no longer available to him. Instead, he circled. A short message, a neutral question, something small enough to deny intention, but deliberate enough to test whether the silence still held. "How have you been?" he wrote. The question was ordinary. Its timing was not. I read it without urgency. That alone told me how much had changed. Months earlier, a message like that would have stirred something: hope, anxiety, a rush to respond in exactly the right way. Now, it simply existed. I answered when I was ready, not when the moment demanded it. "I've been well," I replied. Nothing more. That response unsettled him. I could tell from the pause that followed. People who expect warmth are thrown off by calm. Calm doesn't confirm anything. It doesn't reject either. It leaves interpretation entirely on the other side. He followed up later with an update. Something about work. A minor complication. Nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest he was carrying more than he wanted to admit. He wasn't asking for help. Not yet. He was establishing proximity, testing whether access still existed. I listened. When he finished explaining, he paused as if waiting for advice, reassurance, direction. That pause used to belong to me. I would fill it automatically, offering perspective, smoothing uncertainty, restoring confidence. This time, I didn't. "What do you think?" he asked finally. The question carried weight. It acknowledged something he hadn't said outright, that the silence had changed him too. That independence, while necessary, had been heavier than expected. That absence had revealed things presence had once concealed. "I think you're learning how to carry your own decisions," I said. The words were gentle, but they landed firmly. They didn't solve anything. They didn't offer relief. They reflected responsibility back to him. Responsibility, once returned, cannot be unseen. He didn't argue. That was new. Instead, he grew quiet. Not defensive, not resistant, thoughtful. Silence, for the first time, was shared rather than imposed. That shift mattered more than any apology could have. We spoke a little longer after that. Not about the past, not about reconciliation, about process, about patience, about not rushing clarity when it hasn't arrived yet. I didn't lead the conversation. I didn't manage its direction. I simply participated. When the exchange ended, there was no sense of resolution. There didn't need to be. Something had already been acknowledged without being named. That the silence had not been emptiness. It had been structure. And that structure had shifted the balance between us in a way neither of us could reverse. He checked back, not because I had disappeared, but because the silence had made my presence visible by its absence. Power changed shape after that conversation. It stopped being something that moved outward and became something that held its ground. I didn't assert it. I didn't announce it. I simply stopped reacting in ways that made me predictable. That, I learned, is where authority quietly lives. I noticed it in myself first. When messages arrived, I no longer felt the impulse to respond immediately. Not because I wanted to withhold, but because I no longer felt summoned. The difference was subtle, but profound. Summons imply obligation. Choice implies agency. I was choosing when and how to engage. That choice altered the dynamic completely. My son adjusted his tone again. Questions became clearer. Assumptions disappeared. He stopped speaking as if my response were guaranteed. He waited. Waiting does something to people. It reorders their sense of position. When you wait, you acknowledge that the other person has control over their time and attention. I did not fill the space. Silence remained my ally, but it was no longer strategic. It was natural. I had nothing to prove, nothing to defend, nothing to resolve on his behalf. The absence of reaction created a calm dominance that didn't require enforcement. It simply existed. I realized then that reaction had been my most expensive habit. Reacting had pulled me into urgency that wasn't mine. It had made other people's discomfort my responsibility. It had trained those around me to expect immediate engagement, immediate reassurance, immediate resolution. Removing reaction removed that training. The world adjusted. Requests arrived with more thought. Conversations slowed. Expectations recalibrated themselves without instruction. When you stop reacting, people learn to approach rather than demand. Approach carries respect. Demand never does. My son began to listen differently, not just to my words, but to my pauses. He noticed when I didn't rush, when I didn't soften truth, when I allowed uncertainty to exist without stepping in to manage it. Those moments taught him something he hadn't learned before, that stability doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from restraint. I wasn't withholding guidance. I was modeling self-possession. That distinction mattered. Self-possession doesn't dominate others. It governs itself. And when you govern yourself consistently, others adjust their behavior accordingly. They don't have to be told. They feel it. The silence no longer needed to do the work. I had changed. And change, once integrated, doesn't announce itself with noise. It settles into posture, into pace, into the way you occupy space without apology. I moved through conversations without leaning forward or pulling away. I stayed centered. That center became unmistakable. I wasn't trying to regain influence. I had already reclaimed authority. Learning rarely arrives when someone explains it to you. It arrives when the explanation you expected never comes. That was the lesson my son was beginning to absorb, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through the steady absence of rescue. At first, he resisted the idea without realizing he was doing so. He worked harder, moved faster, took on more responsibility with the confidence of someone determined to prove that independence was enough. There was pride in that effort, and I respected it. Pride, when earned honestly, is not a flaw. But effort alone doesn't replace the things silence removes. It only reveals what had been quietly supporting you all along. I could hear the change in him over time. His certainty softened. Where he once spoke in conclusions, he now spoke in considerations. He began to ask questions that weren't rhetorical. Questions that didn't assume agreement. Questions that required patience rather than reassurance. That shift told me something important. The absence had created space for reflection. Reflection is uncomfortable. It forces you to revisit decisions you've already justified. It asks you to sit with consequences rather than deflect them. For someone used to momentum, that stillness can feel like friction. My son felt it. He didn't say so directly, but it showed in the way he paused more often, the way he chose words more carefully. Not chasing him had also taught him something about access. He realized slowly that access is not automatic, that it's not preserved by history alone, that relationships require mutual regard, not just familiarity. Familiarity had carried him for years. Now, without my pursuit reinforcing it, familiarity had limits. There were moments when he tested those limits, a casual assumption, an implied expectation. Each time, I responded calmly, without urgency, without correction. That calm response, neither affirming nor rejecting, forced him to recalibrate. He couldn't rely on old cues anymore. He had to engage with who I was now, not who I had been. That recalibration was the real lesson. He began to understand that walking away had not made him stronger by default. It had made him responsible. Responsibility, unlike independence, doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels heavy. It asks you to carry outcomes without blaming anyone else. I watched him grow into that weight, not all at once. In fragments, in moments of hesitation, in quieter conversations. Growth rarely looks impressive while it's happening. It looks like uncertainty, like restraint, like choosing not to speak until you've thought something through. Not chasing him had denied him comfort, but it had given him something more durable. Awareness. Awareness of what presence provides. Awareness of how much labor had once been invisible. Awareness that silence is not emptiness, it is feedback. And that feedback, when allowed to stand, teaches more than reassurance ever could. I didn't need him to acknowledge any of this. Learning that belongs to someone else doesn't require your validation. It just requires time. And time, guided by silence, was doing exactly what it needed to do. Independence is often romanticized as freedom without limits, but real independence is heavier than that. It doesn't arrive with applause or relief. It arrives with responsibility that no longer has anywhere else to go. My son was beginning to feel that weight, not because he had failed, but because he had finally stepped fully into his own decisions. At first, the weight showed up as exhaustion, not the physical kind, but the mental kind, the constant calculation, the pressure of choosing without a fallback, the awareness that outcomes would no longer soften themselves. Independence had removed the quiet buffer he never realized was there. Every choice now carried its full consequence. He spoke about it indirectly, about days that felt longer, about decisions that lingered after they were made, about uncertainty that didn't dissolve with confidence alone. These weren't complaints, they were observations. Observations are how people begin to accept reality. I listened without stepping in. There was a time when I would have translated that weight into reassurance, into guidance offered before it was asked for. Now, I allowed him to carry it, not because I wanted him to struggle, but because carrying weight is how strength becomes real rather than theoretical. Independence also demanded something else from him: patience. Without a stabilizing presence absorbing urgency, he had to slow down. Rushed decisions revealed themselves quickly. Assumptions required verification. The pace of his life adjusted, not because he chose slowness, but because speed without support leads to mistakes. Those mistakes were not dramatic. They were small recalibrations, missed expectations, delayed outcomes, adjustments made quietly, without anyone else to blame. That process is humbling. Humility is often the first true sign of maturity. I noticed how he spoke less about control. Earlier, independence had been framed as control over time, over choices, over direction. Now, his language shifted toward management and balance. Control gives way to stewardship when reality intervenes. Stewardship requires care, not certainty. The weight of independence also revealed something about me. I was no longer tempted to step in and lighten it. That urge had faded naturally, replaced by trust not in outcomes, but in process. I trusted that he would learn what he needed to learn in the way learning actually happens, through experience, not rescue. Distance had made that trust possible. Without distance, I would have confused support with intervention. With distance, I could see clearly where my involvement would help and where it would only delay growth. Independence, I realized, is not the absence of others. It is the presence of accountability. My son was learning that lesson now, not through words, but through living it. And while the weight of it pressed on him, it was shaping him into something steadier, something more grounded than certainty ever could. I didn't need to witness that transformation closely. Knowing it was happening was enough. Absence becomes permanent, not when people stop trying, but when they stop expecting. That was the shift I felt one morning without ceremony or warning. There was no date attached to it, no conversation that marked it as official. I simply noticed that I was no longer checking the calendar for reasons to reach out or waiting for the right moment to say something that might reopen a door. The door had found its place. Permanence has a quiet quality. It doesn't ache the way loss does, and it doesn't relieve the way closure does. It settles. Like furniture arranged after a long period of rearranging, it stops calling attention to itself. You move around it without thinking. You stop bumping into the edges. I noticed how naturally my routines had adjusted. Holidays passed without tension. Decisions were made without factoring in reactions. Conversations with others no longer included the careful phrasing that once protected a fragile connection. I wasn't guarding anything anymore. Guarding is what you do when you expect intrusion. I no longer did. My son sensed the permanence before I named it. Our conversations, when they happened, carried a new restraint, not distance restraint. He no longer tested the boundaries casually. He didn't drift into familiarity. He stayed present, measured, aware that access now required intention. That awareness marked a point he could not return from. There was no resentment in it, just recognition. Recognition that the relationship had changed form, and that form was no longer fluid. It held its shape. That stability, even when it included distance, was easier to navigate than constant uncertainty. I felt no urge to reclaim what had been lost. That surprised me most of all. The instinct to repair had faded entirely, replaced by acceptance that did not require justification. Acceptance is often misunderstood as giving up. In truth, it is choosing not to fight reality. The permanence of absence also brought clarity. I could see the relationship as it was, not as I hoped it might become. I could acknowledge what it offered and what it no longer could. That clarity allowed me to engage honestly, without overreach or withdrawal. I wasn't holding space anymore. I was occupying my own. That distinction freed me from responsibility I had carried unnecessarily for years. Responsibility for moods, outcomes, interpretations that were never mine to manage. With that weight gone, absence stopped feeling like something imposed and started feeling like something integrated. The point of no return had been crossed quietly. Not when he walked away, not when I stayed silent, but when I stopped expecting anything to change. And in that expectation's absence, I found something unexpectedly steady. Peace that didn't depend on distance closing, only on it being respected. Silence returned things to me that I hadn't realized I had misplaced. Not all at once, and not dramatically. They came back quietly, like items found at the bottom of a drawer you stopped opening years ago. Familiar, intact, and surprisingly useful. The first thing silence returned was agency. I noticed it in how I made decisions. I no longer paused to imagine how they would be received. I didn't anticipate reactions or preempt misunderstandings. Decisions stood on their own merits. If they aligned with my values, they were enough. That simplicity brought a steadiness I hadn't known I was missing. Silence also returned time. Not empty hours, but unclaimed ones. Time that wasn't earmarked for managing emotions, smoothing tensions, or preparing explanations. Mornings unfolded without urgency. Evenings ended without mental rehearsals of conversations that might never happen. Time stopped feeling borrowed and started feeling owned. With time came attention. I began to notice details again, the rhythm of my days, the cadence of my thoughts, the subtle signals my body had been sending for years. Fatigue no longer hid behind responsibility. Rest no longer required justification. When something felt off, I listened. When something felt right, I allowed it to remain uncomplicated. Silence returned my voice, too. Not in the sense of speaking more, but in the sense of speaking honestly when I did. I no longer softened truths to keep peace. I didn't sharpen them either. I stated what was true and let it stand. The need to persuade had disappeared. That absence made my words lighter and more precise. I noticed a change in my posture with others. I wasn't leaning forward anymore. I wasn't pulling away. I stood where I was. That centeredness altered conversations without effort. People approached differently. Requests were clearer. Expectations adjusted themselves. When you stop overextending, others learn where to meet you. Silence also returned dignity. Dignity isn't something others grant you. It's something you stop bargaining away. By refusing to chase, explain, or perform for acceptance, I had reclaimed it. Not loudly, not defiantly, quietly. And once reclaimed, it required no defense. The most unexpected return was peace. Not the temporary peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the durable kind that comes from alignment. Alignment between what I valued and how I lived. Alignment between what I tolerated and what I accepted. That peace didn't fluctuate with contact or distance. It remained steady. Silence had not isolated me. It had clarified me. And in that clarity, I understood something I hadn't before. Strength doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like stillness held without apology, like boundaries maintained without explanation, like a life lived without waiting for permission to begin. Silence had returned me to myself. Acceptance did not arrive with reconciliation. There was no return to how things were, no emotional meeting point where everything softened into understanding. What arrived instead was something sturdier and far less fragile. Clarity without expectation. I accepted that some relationships do not circle back, not because they failed, but because they completed the purpose they were meant to serve. The bond between a parent and a child changes over time, but sometimes it changes in ways that cannot be renegotiated. That truth is difficult to face when you believe love must always restore what distance takes away. I no longer believe that. Acceptance, for me, was not an agreement with what happened. It was an acknowledgement of what could no longer be undone. I didn't rewrite the past to make it easier to carry. I let it remain what it was, messy, incomplete, unresolved. Resolution is not always required for peace. My son and I existed now in parallel. We knew of each other's lives without inhabiting them. Updates came occasionally, stripped of emotional weight. There was respect in that distance, even if there was no warmth. Respect is often the first form of peace after disappointment. I stopped imagining future conversations, the ones where everything would be said correctly, where understanding would finally land, where apologies would arrive with the exact tone that makes them matter. Those imagined moments had kept me tethered to an outcome that depended on someone else's readiness. Letting them go was an act of maturity, not surrender. Acceptance also meant releasing the need to be remembered a certain way. I didn't need to be seen as right, or patient, or wronged. Those labels are heavy, and they bind you to a story that keeps repeating. I chose to step out of that narrative entirely. The truth didn't need defending. It simply existed. There were moments when the absence of reunion felt noticeable. Not painful, noticeable, like a missing note in a familiar song. You recognize it, but you continue listening anyway. Life doesn't stop to correct what's incomplete. It carries on, inviting you to do the same. I noticed how much lighter that felt. Without the hope of reunion shaping my expectations, I was free to engage with the present as it was. No waiting, no preparing, no bracing for disappointment or relief, just reality, met without resistance. Acceptance without reunion did not mean the relationship was dead. It meant it was defined by boundaries rather than longing, by mutual distance rather than forced closeness, by respect rather than obligation. That definition gave it a stability it had lacked before. I didn't need to forgive everything to accept reality. Forgiveness may come someday, or it may not. Acceptance was enough to live well without waiting for anything else to change. And in that acceptance, I found something that reconciliation could not have given me at that stage: freedom. Letting go is often described as release, an opening of the hand, a softening of grip. That description never fit my experience. What I learned was that letting go is not about loosening your hold on someone else. It's about loosening your hold on who you thought you had to be in order to stay connected. For a long time, I believed letting go meant losing something essential, that if I stopped holding on, the relationship would disappear entirely, and with it, a part of my identity. Parents are rarely taught how to step back without feeling replaced. We are taught endurance, not transition. The truth is quieter. Letting go didn't erase the bond. It removed the struggle. I stopped measuring my worth by proximity. I stopped equating silence with rejection. I stopped interpreting distance as failure. Those interpretations had kept me tethered to pain long after the situation itself had stabilized. Releasing them felt like setting down a weight I'd forgotten I was carrying. Letting go also required honesty. Honesty about what I could control and what I could not. I could not control my son's choices, timing, or understanding. I could control how much of myself I sacrificed trying to influence them. That boundary, once recognized, changed everything. I noticed how often people confuse letting go with indifference. Indifference is numbness. Letting go is clarity. I still cared. I simply cared without attachment to outcome. That distinction preserved compassion without draining it. It allowed me to wish him well without waiting for proof that my wishes mattered. There is power in that separation. Power that doesn't dominate or withdraw, but steadies. When you stop needing someone else's response to validate your position, you become less reactive and more present. Presence, I learned, is the opposite of control. It invites honesty without demanding it. Letting go also dismantled an old fear. The fear that distance would make me irrelevant. That, without constant involvement, I would fade from importance. What actually happened was the opposite. By stepping back, I stopped competing for relevance. I allowed my presence to be defined by choice rather than necessity. That kind of presence doesn't beg to be noticed. It stands. I understood then that letting go is not an ending, it's a reorientation. It turns your focus inward, away from managing relationships and toward maintaining integrity. Integrity doesn't guarantee closeness. It guarantees peace. And peace, once experienced, changes what you are willing to tolerate. Letting go did not make me smaller. It made me exact about where I stood, what I offered, and what I would no longer trade away for the illusion of connection. That precision became the foundation for everything that followed. I wasn't drifting anymore. I was grounded. Living without explanation felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping outside without checking the weather. For years, I had prepared my words in advance, anticipating questions, softening truths, offering context so no one would misunderstand my intentions. Explanation had become a reflex, not a choice. Letting go of it required trust, not in others' understanding, but in my right to act without permission. I noticed the change in everyday moments. When I declined invitations, I didn't follow up with reasons. When I made decisions, I didn't frame them to sound reasonable. I stated them plainly and allowed silence to do the rest. Silence, I had learned, doesn't need justification. It only needs consistency. Some people were unsettled by that. They searched for hidden meanings, assumed distance, or projected conclusions. I let them. Explanation would have pulled me back into managing perceptions. I wasn't interested in that anymore. Misinterpretation is often the cost of autonomy, and I decided it was affordable. Living without explanation also clarified relationships. Those built on mutual respect adjusted easily. They met me where I stood, without demanding translation. Others, accustomed to access and reassurance, drifted away when they realized I would no longer narrate my choices for their comfort. That sorting happened naturally, without confrontation. I found relief in the simplicity. Days unfolded without rehearsal. Conversations ended without lingering doubt. I wasn't revisiting interactions to see if I had said enough or too much. The mental space that opened up felt expansive. In that space, creativity returned. Curiosity returned. Quiet joy returned, unannounced and unforced. I thought less about my son during this time, not because he mattered less, but because my life no longer revolved around unresolved questions. When thoughts of him did arise, they were steady and neutral. I wished him well without needing to be involved in the proof of it. That detachment was not coldness. It was completion. Living without explanation also taught me restraint. I spoke when it mattered. I listened when it didn't. I allowed discomfort to exist without trying to resolve it for everyone else. That restraint gave my words weight. When I did speak, people paid attention not because I demanded it, but because I hadn't exhausted their attention with constant clarification. I understood then that explanations often function as apologies in disguise. By removing them, I stopped apologizing for being whole. The world didn't collapse. It adjusted. And in that adjustment, I found a life that felt honest, durable, and fully mine, unburdened by the need to be understood in order to be at peace. The ending did not arrive with a conversation. It arrived one ordinary day when I realized I was no longer waiting for anything to happen. No message I hoped would come. No silence I needed explained. No future version of the relationship I was holding open space for. That realization was so subtle it almost passed unnoticed, and yet it marked the truest ending of all. Life had continued, steadily and without drama. I woke up, moved through my day, made choices, and returned to myself without checking whether those choices aligned with anyone else's expectations. The absence that once felt significant had blended into the background, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been fully accepted. I understood then that some stories don't end with reconciliation or regret. They end with alignment. Alignment between who you are and how you live, between what you value and what you tolerate, between the silence you choose and the peace it gives back. That alignment does not need witnesses. It does not need agreement. It simply holds. My son remained a part of my life in the way reality allowed, not as a constant presence, not as an unresolved ache, but as a truth I no longer resisted. I wished him well without expectation. I carried no resentment, no longing, no unfinished sentences waiting to be spoken. Silence had done its work. It had stripped away illusion. It had returned responsibility. It had clarified boundaries that words never could. Most importantly, it had returned me to myself whole, unburdened, and steady. I did not chase the ending. I allowed it. And in allowing it, I found something far more lasting than explanation or apology. I found peace that did not require anyone else to change. That was how the story ended. Not loudly, not bitterly, but quietly, exactly where it needed to.